Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another meeting on a rather cold and blustery evening, but I'm very pleased to see such a good turnout, so thank you very much. We'll start the meeting by inviting the Director to read the minutes of the last meeting.
Good evening. The minutes of the meeting of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland held at 6 p.m. in the auditorium NMS on Monday the 12th October 2015. David Caldwell, President of the Society, in the chair. The minutes of the last meeting were read and approved. The following communication was read. A war of words, propaganda in the wars of the rough wooings by Dr. Amy Blakeway. The same communication was read at 7:30 p.m. on Tuesday 13th October 2015 in the Regent Building Lecture Theatre, Regent Walk, Aberdeen. Jackson Armstrong in the chair.
Thanks, Simon. Is that a correct record? Can I? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay, can I sign that to the correct record? Thank you. I have a pen somewhere. I do. Hooray, yes. Do we have any other notices?
Just one brief one.
Just a brief notice to remind you all, of course, that the AGM is at the end of the month, St Andrew's Day, and the papers for that will be going out later this week, so they should be arriving with you over the weekend, early next week, thereabouts. If you've not heard anything from us as a fellow by the end of next week, please do get in touch with us, because we'll have to get you that material before the AGM. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon. Well, not only this evening do we have the headline talk by Miles Oglethorpe, but we have a very short presentation, first of all, by Martin Conlon, who was one of the students we gave a bursary to attend the EAA conference in Glasgow earlier on. And Martin's going to tell us a few words about his project. He's a student with the Scottish Oral History Centre at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, and he's already a fellow of the Society. Martin.
Hi, thank you for that introduction. I won't speak for too long. I know everyone's very keen to hear Miles talk. But my name is Martin. I'm a PhD student. I'm in my first year at the University of Strathclyde. I'm working with the Scottish Oral History Centre. I've been asked to say a few words primarily about my research, but more importantly about some of the ways in which the Society helps early career researchers like myself and many others. So what is it that I actually do? I study these things, giant cranes along the River Clyde. There are only 4 of them left in Scotland. At some stage in the world there's been up to around 50 of these. They service shipyards and docks across the world, primarily in the UK, but also shipped out to Nagasaki, Malaysia, and also India as well. And as is some of the links between myself and what Miles will say, I suppose many have guessed that the link is Sir William Arrol. Arrol, the sort of preeminent engineer of the Victorian era. This is an amazing image from HES's collections, which show the Rigby Street crane works, where these cranes were put together. I'm interested in their early history, but I'm also interested in the way that they've changed. Deindustrialisation of the 70s and 80s obviously hit structural steel and arrows in particular very hard. But far from being forgotten, the cranes have now sort of been reborn, and they crop up everywhere. This is in the news. Some of the sort of most public-facing bits of archaeology in public life these days. This is the Commonwealth Games opening ceremony too. You can see the crane on the right-hand side. And I know we have them now on money too, crane currency. That's Sir William Arrol in the centre there. The bridge that Miles will be talking about soon to your left, and in the right, if you look closely, you can see the crane. These cranes have been reborn in other ways too. This was creatively and artistically in 1987. George Wiley used the crane as an installation for a straw locomotive. He ceremoniously suspended a straw locomotive using the Finnieston crane for several days, waiting for a ship that would never come, symbolically, and then burnt it to reveal a sort of smouldering question mark, asking him questions of the sort of wider legacy of deindustrialisation in Scotland. And so too has regeneration also been a thing with these cranes. And this is in Clydebank now. The crane is now a heritage centre and museum. You can bungee jump from it. You can get married on it. There's even a bar there for a short time. But it's through the EAA and my sponsorship there, which was greatly received from society, that I was able to share some of my ideas. EAA, I should say, was the European Association of Archaeologists' 21st meeting. It happened in Glasgow, and these conferences are often very expensive to attend. So a bursary is such a huge, almost invaluable source of income to help me and many others attend. So 10 of us were lucky enough to benefit from the Society's contribution. We gave papers there, we celebrated each other's work. We also promoted the various institutions that we're from and gave posters. It was a really lively few days. DLitt too, some of you may know, DLitt is a sort of year-long promotion and celebration of Scottish archaeology. DLitt has a really great newsletter that is showing all the sort of amazing energy in Scottish archaeology at the moment. I'm looking for people to talk about some of their memories of the cranes, whether it's crane drivers, whether it's people that have been creatively, artistically inspired by them. And DLitt was a great platform for that, sharing my call for respondents. And I've received loads of really grateful or really great contributions from folk. So that's sort of how I'll end, but it just shows you the ways in which the Society supports young people like myself, or early career researchers too, to promote and disseminate some of our work in Scotland. And that owes a lot to the fellows that contribute yearly, and it's a really positive relationship that everyone has. Thank you very much. Cheers.
Thank you very much, Martin. Well, many of you will know that the Forth Bridge was inscribed as a World Heritage Site by UNESCO in July this year, and thus joins a select group of major monuments throughout the world. And we're delighted to have Miles Oglethorpe with us tonight to tell us about the bridge and how and why it got to this situation. Miles is currently Head of Industrial Heritage and Digital at HES. Before that, he has had a long, distinguished career working for different organisations in Scotland, including Arcams, Historic Scotland, and a spell at the Strathclyde University. One of his particular interests and specialities is industrial heritage, and he is obviously the expert on the bridge, and we're delighted to hear what he has to say about it tonight. So, Miles.
Thank you very much indeed. And first, let me say what a pleasure, an honour, and indeed a relief it is to be able to speak to you today about the inscription of the Forth Bridge. And I'd also just like to thank Martin for such an uplifting start to the evening. That's a crane joke, by the way. And I should say that you might not have seen the last of cranes. They may accidentally insert themselves into the presentation later on. And I also just like to cite this fantastic image, which is on the Forth Bridge's website by Peter Devlin. It was arranged by Network Rail, who put him on the bridge on the 5th of July when the Tornado steam locomotive, I think it was the Scottish Railway Preservation Society train, pulled by the Tornado, just happened to be going over at the same time as the nomination was reaching its conclusion in Bonn. It's a very poignant moment, and so these are fantastic digital images. So what I'm going to do today is give you a bit of background to the Forth Bridge, but not much, because I think most of you know quite a lot about it, and some of you have heard me talk a lot about it before. I'm going to spend some time talking about World Heritage because it's much misunderstood, and I think it's important to understand what it is and what's actually happened in the context of this nomination. Then a bit of background about how it all started for the Forth Bridge, and then the next section is called a second chance, because we had a chance, missed it, and then we had a second chance. Who, how, and what was involved. Then we're going to take a look at the nomination document very, very briefly, just to see what it involved, and the management plan itself. Now, this may sound boring, but after today's meeting of the management group, the first meeting of the management group, I'll try and make it a bit more exciting than it might otherwise be. And then what actually happened in Bonn, because it was a bit weird. and then what might happen now as a consequence of the inscription. But before I do that, I just thought it would be fun to reflect on the iconic power of the bridge, which is often quoted. And it appears in all sorts of art, commercial and otherwise. And this is a beautiful railway poster using the bridge to advertise tourism in Scotland, of course. But there is an unfortunate tendency, just like the press, to like to build things up and then destroy them. It does, in popular culture, it does appear quite frequently in a slightly destructive context. I'm grateful to Craig Bowman of Network Rail for alerting us to the Thunderbirds image on the top left, where the bridge actually hasn't been damaged, but most of the other sort of comic strip stuff seems to take some pleasure in destroying the bridge in some way. And it's not just overt comic strips. Have you noticed the uncanny resemblance to the bridge on the River Kwai with the Forth Bridge, albeit in wood? And during the nomination, there were times where Mark Watson and I, who worked on the nomination document, were hallucinating, and there were extremely disturbing things, not drug-assisted, I hasten to add, happened during that period. And of course, commercially, it's been used for a number of mischievous uses. This is a particularly famous Iron Brew commercial, and in esteemed publications such as the Sunday Post, it has appeared more than once in the Bruins in this instance. So it is a very, very powerful, iconic thing. And equally, where do you have a meeting on the morning after the custard tide took over Scotland in the general election? You have it in front of the Forth Bridge, and this was a particularly interesting and powerful image. So it is a political symbol as well, whether we like it or not. So some very quick background to the bridge. Many of you will know that it was born of disaster, born as a result of the collapse of Thomas Boucher's Tay Bridge in 1879. And this engineering failure resulted in a complete rethink of Boucher's Forth Bridge, which was already under construction at the time. And there are, for those of you who are interested, some extraordinary photographs online, both of the aftermath of the disaster in Dundee, but also of the rebuilding of the Tay Bridge. And these are available through Dundee Leisure. And it's worth noting, as we move on from this, that the company responsible for all this amazing rebuilding work was none other than William Arrol and Company, who were building the Tay Bridge, the Forth Bridge at the same time, and were also building the steel framework of Tower Bridge in London. So Arrol had become a major force in civil engineering by this time. Now, the key difference in the design of the new bridge by Baker and Fowler, two English engineers, was the cantilever design, which provided much more stiffness and much more robust in the storm conditions that were worried about in the context of the Tay Bridge disaster. And this is a particularly famous image because it features an engineer who studied under Henry Dyer, the Glaswegian engineer, in Tokyo, where they established a university, and then came to study at Glasgow University. His name is Kaiichi Watanabe, and then he went and worked on the Forth Bridge after graduating from Glasgow University. And this is a very famous picture of him demonstrating the cantilever principle. You can also, those of you with good eyesight, see this on the Bank of Scotland £20 note. And in fact, there is the £20 note on the right-hand side. And just to give you an idea of how revered Watanabe is, there is a huge amount of material, historical stuff, existing online in Japan, for example. And this is his matriculation form from Glasgow University. Now, one of the great things about the Forth Bridge, and one of the things that made the nomination a lot easier than it might have been, is the documentation of its construction is outstandingly good. And the best collection of photographic records sits with the National Records of Scotland, the British Rail collections. Now, there are other superb collections of material, not least with Network Rail in York under the care of Vicky Stretch of Network Rail, as we discovered, you'll see a bit later. But there is this marvellous series of glass plate negatives, glass plate photographs taken by Evelyn Carey. And it was a truly incredible engineering wonder of the world. The scale of it was phenomenal, and there was quite a lot of output in journals at the time. It was a huge attraction. Jamie Troughton up in Blair Castle, he's related to John Fowler, one of the designers, and he's got the visitor's book And all sorts of people from all over the world, like Henry Bessemer, Eiffel, all sorts of people came to see this being built. Now, the entertaining thing, this is an image from the Royal Commission's collections. There's a series of images that demonstrate that you can fit 6 Eiffel Towers, 2 in each tower of the bridge. Something that Punch magazine thought was hilarious and took the mickey out of how pathetic the Eiffel Tower was compared to the Forth Bridge, which is, as we all know, totally unfair. And the big difference was this was built from mild steel. Siemens Martin open hearth mild steel, a new material at the time, far better than Bessemer steel, and of course the Eiffel Tower was wrought iron. Now, I'm not going to go much further as far as the details of the bridge are concerned. Here's a really good Ralston of Glasgow postcard that gives you a really good sort of summary of the statistics, but it's 2.5 kilometers long. Those of us who were involved in the production of the nomination document had a horrible moment when we realized that there was a typo on the front summary page that said it was 2.5 meters long, but fortunately nobody noticed, so we got away with it. And it's a truly huge structure, and although the Quebec Bridge, as we'll come to later, the Quebec Bridge in Canada has a longer span, it only has 1 span, so this is altogether a much bigger structure, and altogether far more beautiful. So now I'm going to talk a bit about World Heritage. And the first thing to say about World Heritage is, we already had one banknote, we've got a bit more money here. I just wanted to say that in Scotland, we tend to throw World Heritage at money rather than money at World Heritage. So those of you that enjoy the Clydesdale Bank series, they are wonderful. There's also the Bank of Scotland £20 note I mentioned earlier. And as Martin said, there is this truly magnificent £5 plastic note. Those of you that have them should know that Clydesdale Bank are apparently going to reissue these, but without the word nomination on it. So these ones might become more valuable in due course. And there's Martin's giant cantilever crane from Clyde Bank in the bottom right-hand corner. And we have a relation of Sir William Arrol in the audience tonight, which makes it all extra exciting. Now, the important thing to remember about World Heritage is it's a much desired, much sought after thing. But it's not widely understood. So you often hear people saying, or councils or institutions saying, we want to make this we're going to apply to become a World Heritage Site. And this happened not so long ago for Kirkcaldy, wanted to be a World Heritage Site because of Adam Smith and other wonderful things that happen in Kirkcaldy, like linoleum. And the problem is it's a lot more complicated than that. So I just thought it'd be quite useful just to run through, as part of the journey, just what sort of things it involves. And the Forth Bridge first appeared on the UK tentative list in 1999. And I've got a slide up here of the Pontcysocta Aqueduct page from that World Heritage tentative list, because that was the last UK successful nomination, which happened in 2009, of course, Thomas Telford, which makes it of extra interest to us. So this was a World Heritage list that was infused with industrial heritage for the first time, a tentative list, I should say. And quite a lot, apart from Pontcysocta Aqueduct, you can see here, quite a lot of those nominations were in fact inscribed. One of the most important for us was New Lanark, but there was a series of other ones like Derwent Valley and Saltaire. And so this was a good period for industrial heritage, but for some reason, I'm not exactly sure how, but Mark Watson may be able to help with this in question and answers later on, the Forth Bridge never quite made it. And so there it is, there's the Forth Bridge page from the tentative list. So then what happened, much more recently, was that people started to get a bit of World Heritage fatigue and started to question its value. So we had a study carried out by PricewaterhouseCoopers, which suggested that given all the expense involved in nominating and then managing World Heritage Sites, really it was pretty marginal. And there was a suggestion, perhaps, that the UK certainly would slow down its rate of nomination, but would actually possibly not do it at all. And this was quite a shock for some people, not least those areas that were really keen to get inscribed. One of those areas was the Lake District, and there was an economist called James Rebanks, who quite a few of you will have met or heard speak before, who put the case for World Heritage in a much more cogent way. And this This is his document, which has proved to be extremely useful. Now, James has gone on to be a great advocate for the benefits of World Heritage and works a lot for UNESCO. And he identified different reasons for wanting to be a World Heritage Site, which I'm not going to go through them. But it was a very useful, structured way of looking at World Heritage and the benefits it can bring. And it's important to say that they're not mutually exclusive, so quite a few World Heritage nominations have bits of more than one of these reasons for trying to become a World Heritage Site. So how did it all start for the Forth Bridge nomination itself? I think the first thing to say is that we almost didn't have a working Forth Bridge. And does anybody remember the Serpell report in the 1980s in the Thatcher era? I mean, there was a suggestion, one of the options was to shut down the railways north of Edinburgh and Glasgow. So what would we have done with a Forth Bridge that wasn't being used? It would have been a really seriously difficult conservation issue, for one thing. And then, of course, Railtrack was born, and Railtrack lived a few years, and then we had the Hatfield disaster, and everything imploded, and then we got Network Rail. And during the course of that process, from being in a position where it didn't look great, it looked worse than it actually was, Network Rail and its predecessor Railtrack decided to invest heavily in the bridge. And this was the point at which a great Scottish institution or great Scottish turn of phrase was put under great threat. The term, it's like painting the Forth Bridge, is an ever unending task, has in fact been taken apart because they've restored the bridge and now that process is no longer necessary. And in 2011, the bridge ended up looking, or 2012-ish, looking far better perhaps than it had ever looked. But the process of getting it into that condition was a fantastic opportunity for us. And there are one or two people here who are directly involved. We have representatives from Network Rail and for the contractors, Balfour Beatty, who were heavily involved in this process. So for many years, most of us just thought this white encapsulation was growing like a fungus on the bridge and it was just kind of moving around like phylloxera or something. And in fact, it was the most, if you look at the texture on the bottom left, for example, it was the most incredible engineering achievement. And this isn't the moment to go into too much detail but about how they did it, because that's really for them to describe. But if you look at these images taken in 2011, just the scale of the work that was done is truly, truly fantastic. And borrowing figures from Network Rail and Balfour Beatty, we're talking about 4,000 tons of scaffolding, 4.5 million working hours, 1,500 people employed since 2002, 240,000 litres of paint, having recently undergone some domestic DIY. The thought of 240,000 litres of paint is truly a nightmare. I'm looking at somebody over there in particular. And during that time, the trains were not disrupted. So we're talking about a really busy bridge, over 200 trains a day. It was completed in 2012 after 12 years. And really that was the green light, because suddenly we had a bridge that was already wonderful, but absolutely shone. And I thought I'd include just some images just to give you a sense of the scale of the work. And a new paint system, and Ian will correct me, but a glass flake, epoxy, several layers. But the really key thing was they had to take off the old lead bait or paint which had lead in it, the old Craig and Rose paint. And the reason there was the encapsulation was because he didn't want that falling into the water because it was toxic. So it's an immensely complicated project on an immense scale and a truly, truly great achievement. And this is the man responsible for the project, seen here, Ian Heath of Network Rail, on his own domain. As I said, this is a mainline structure. And so to achieve that, the way they did was truly extraordinary. And it has received justifiably lots of awards. So we were commenting today in one of our meetings that it's a bit like dentistry. There was a build-up of plaques. And there is actually a conservation issue as where to put them, because it really has received the recognition that it deserves. And we shouldn't forget that the people actually did the work and are continuing to do the work looking after the bridge when we think about the accolade that it deserves. So what that did was give us a second chance. And around that time, we had a policy team in Historic Scotland, and on top left, Laura Bailey and I went to see Network Rail and said, look, we know that there's going to be a new UK tentative list. Would you consider changing your mind about it being put up for nomination? And initially, there was a bit of a negative reaction. But then subsequently, with the arrival of David Simpson as the director of Network Rail in Scotland, a complete change of heart. And ever since then, it's been fantastic working with Network Rail and with our colleagues in Transport Scotland. So we've got this, as you'll see in a moment, there's been a tremendous working relationship that's developed between the key partners. And another key person here was Mark Lawson, who worked directly with the UK government in trying to ensure that the bridge ended up on the new tentative list. So this is a subtle reference to the UK government. Only the slightly compromising thing is that all these telephone boxes were made in Scotland, which is a nice detail, should you ever be lurking there. So what happened was there was an invitation put out to people across Scotland and the UK generally to nominate sites for inclusion in the UK tentative list. And about 38 sent nominations in. We were not allowed to, under the new rules, i.e. any sort of state party. So in the end, it was Douglas Spears of Fife Council who did the vital thing. If it weren't for Douglas, we wouldn't have had a nomination. And what happened subsequently was, there's a bit of Shetland there. What happened subsequently was a group of about a dozen sites were chosen to go forward onto the new UK tentative list, of which the Forth Bridge was one. And in Scotland, we had Musa, Old Scatness and Jarlshof, and we had the Flow Country, as well as the Forth Bridge. So that was quite a significant reduction exercise, and there were a number of people, particularly in Arbroath and Glasgow, who were obviously very disappointed about not being included in the list. The key point about this is that the nominations don't go forward every year. It's every 2 or 3 years. So there's a very slow nomination process. This is supposed to last for about 10 years. And there's competition to decide who goes next. And very fortunately, the Forth Bridge was chosen to be the first UK site to go forward in the next tranche of nominations. So that's how we got going so quickly. And that would not have been possible, again, without the work of Network Rail in restoring the bridge, without the support of Network Rail and Transport Scotland. The other thing I wanted to say was it wasn't it wasn't beyond our notice that there was a huge amount of political support for this at all levels. But it was worth citing the former First Minister, as we like to call him, because he had been promoting the Forth Bridge for years and years and years. And he was writing articles in the Scotsman, they were conducting polls, and the Forth Bridge constantly won the poll of the most important structure in Scotland. And so there was a great political expectation sitting behind us that we would do this and get it pushed forward. And without that, again, we wouldn't have achieved what we managed to achieve. So who, how, and what? Now, this nomination process was a partnership process, and it involved all the local authorities, particularly Edinburgh in the south and Fife in the north, but also West Lothian on the western fringes. Obviously, the owners, Network Rail, and Transport Scotland. And the great thing for us, having Transport Scotland on board, was because they had established, at the request of ministers, an organisation called the Forth Bridges Forum, which looked after all the bridges and coordinated issues relating to all the bridges. And this allowed us, well, once Douglas had actually put the nomination in, for us to formally use the Forth Bridges Forum as the means of submitting the nomination. And Transport Scotland administer the Forth Bridges Forum and therefore been an absolutely crucial part of this process. There was ourselves, Historic Scotland, and we were involved in putting together actual nomination dossier. It was myself and Mark Watson principally in Historic Scotland. But then there's Visit Scotland, who managed issues relating to, obviously, to visitors and tourism. And what was FETA, the Forth Estuary Transport Authority, and the Forth Replacement Crossing. Because what we have here, as has been commented a number of times, is a bridge for each century, over 3 centuries. We have a remarkable situation of 3 bridges, the second bridge, the Forth Road Bridge, also being constructed by William Arrell in the early 1960s and being very important in its own time. So this was a partnership job. You cannot, if you read the UNESCO guidelines, you cannot do this on your own. You've got to have everybody on board. You've got to have the owners 100% behind you. And you've got to have all of your stakeholders fully committed. And sitting beneath that in the steering group were the community councils and a range of other groups, heritage trusts and so on, that provided us far more in the way of texture and local support. So one of the things we had to do, as you generally have to do, is to have a public consultation, which was really exciting. And so over 3 months, we had a web-based consultation, but people could also do it manually if they wanted. We sent our team out into the wild to meet with people. We had local meetings in local community centres, and most important, we sent our operatives out into Waverley Station. This is my colleague Mark, having what turned out to be a quite eventful, he's not happy, a quite eventful day, really, dealing with real people, real commuters, some of whom had heard of the Forth Bridge. It was quite disturbing how many hadn't, so there you go. So it was a thoroughly entertaining and a very, very important exercise for us in terms of learning what the public perception of the bridge was. And we collected a lot of data and a lot of attitudes, and that proved to be quite important in how we put together the nomination. We also, through Transport Scotland and the Forth Bridges Forum, have established a Forth Bridges website, and the Forth Bridge pages within that are very important for the World Heritage side of things. And they will be constantly evolving from now on, just in case I forget to mention that later on. We got James Rebanks back. We did something terrible to him, but we got him back to tell us what he felt we could do with the Forth Bridge in terms of its World Heritage potential. And so he spoke to a lot of business community people and put together quite an interesting report. This is a sad story. I heard Ian chuckle there, because this is James Rebanks on top of the bridge, getting hypothermia and ultimately pneumonia. So we actually put him in hospital. And he wasn't able to get to Kyoto to a UNESCO conference as a result of us, so we are ashamed of ourselves. But James did provide some useful feedback, which we'll come back to later. We also indulged in other engagement exercises, not least a local photographic competition. Now, I don't know whether you've taken really rubbish pictures of the Forth Bridge. I have, and it's actually really hard to take a good photograph of the bridge that does it justice. But we got some tremendous photographs as a result of the World Heritage photographic competition, and again, it was a really good opportunity for public engagement. This was the one that won, and it was a foggy day, rather like last week, but not foggy enough for the bridge to disappear, and the night lighting just showed it off at its best. It's truly, truly marvellous. So that was tremendous. So I thought I would share one of the weirder outputs of the bridge nomination process. Someone wrote a poem. And we had a discussion with our cabinet secretary, who didn't really understand some of the photographs we chose for the first draft of the nomination. But when we got her to the top of the bridge, she just said, "It's definitely a girl." And I said, "Why?" She said, "Because it's got so many beautiful curves." And so I felt the urge after that to share with her this wonderful piece of poetry by a man called Keith Armstrong, who I think hails from Fife. And I think probably I should move on now before everybody gets overexcited. But really, truly tremendous. And so the Forth Bridge induces passion in people, which is I find, entirely understandable. So to cut a long story short, you'll see some of these documents in a moment, but we finally completed the dossier in January. It was delivered in time by our designers and printers, the stand in Glasgow. And this is the moment where Mark, what's on the left, Mari McKee aided us in the final stages, without whom we might have been derailed, and myself. And this is the dossier. Now, this is a diet dossier. This is a super slim nomination, because we had seen what had happened with the Pontchartrain Aqueduct in Seville when it was inscribed. The World Heritage Committee had said, "Thank you for not delivering something that's 1,000 pages long and full of irrelevant stuff." So we thought, well, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to have a very, very slim document that does exactly what it needs to do and no more. And so that was the reason it's so small. And then, shortly afterwards, this is the moment when, the curvy moment when we took our Cabinet Secretary to the top of the bridge, and this is the 24th of January, just a few days before the deadline for it having to be sent to Paris. And then we sent Mark to Paris because there was various transport strikes. We thought the only way to do this was to get the 3 copies, the mandatory 3 copies to UNESCO, with Mark, and he also went to see the UK ambassador, who we'll see in a moment, and got it properly stamped and signed. So that was all jolly good, and everything worked. And it was also an incredibly warm day for January. It was that really, really a lovely, lovely moment for all. So after that, that was January 2014. We then, as all nominations do, had to endure the technical evaluation mission. And at the same time, having put together a program for an expert sent to us in this instance from France with an assistant from Ireland, we then got a letter from the desk assessment team in Paris with 13 questions in it. And that was really, really difficult. You just undergo a period of utter paranoia. You're trying to work out what they really mean. But having such a brilliant expert in Professor Michel Scot, we were from Lyon, he was able to help us interpret a lot of what the questions were really after. So, in fact, the evaluation process, far from being really intimidating, turned out to be a thoroughly rewarding process, and actually brought a lot of us together. I mean, I'm looking at Sharon from Transport Scotland here. We met a few people we'd never actually met before, and we had great meetings at Network Rail and Transport Scotland and in the communities and so on. So it really was marvellous. And we got also the most fantastic weather. So here is an important moment where Ian is describing to Professor Scott, I forgot what it was, probably corrosion patterns or non-corrosion patterns or one of those things. And also, we took them to the place where potentially there might be a visitor experience centre on the north side of the bridge as well, so they could get a sense of what that might be. And then Vicky Stretch came up from York, and we saw records that we didn't know existed, including, thank goodness, the original title deeds of the bridge, which was quite reassuring in its own way. Some fantastic maps, drawings, wind bracing calculations, an amazing range of stuff which complements what's held in the National Records of Scotland beautifully, and also down in Imperial College in London. So this was, it really was a positive experience. And here on the south side, we were looking at the bearings. So let's have a quick look at the nomination document, just so you understand precisely what this process involves. So this was the front of the nomination document. You saw Fiona Hislop brandishing on top of the bridge on the 24th of January. And its job is to establish, without doubt, the outstanding universal value of the bridge. So it contains a series of chapters, sometimes very repetitive because there is a template you have to follow, which makes it seem illogical if you try to read it from start to finish, that basically lay down the justification for the nomination. And there are 10 criteria that you have to align your nomination to if you put in a nomination. And I think, is it 6 of them are unnatural and 4 are natural, something like that? Because you can have natural World Heritage sites, but this obviously was a cultural one. And we nominated it under these 3. And again, now is not the place to go into many detail, but it's worth noting that we failed to get the criteria 2 accepted by ICOMOS, the advisors to UNESCO. And we were okay with that because they accepted the other 2. And you only really need 1, so that was fine. So it wasn't a problem. And one of the things we had to do was to demonstrate that there wasn't another Forth bridge out there, or not lots of Forth bridges out there. And I do hope none of you saw an interview I did for Scottish Television in January 2014, where I was completely incoherent, and for that reason they hardly included anything I said, but there happened to be an Irish couple of tourists standing nearby, and so they went to speak to them, and they were far more articulate than I was. And they said, oh, yes, we've got one of these in Ireland. And I thought, no, you haven't. Really. So, God, disaster. So, anyway, we completed a comparative study, and we relied upon particularly the work of the International Committee on the Conservation of Industrial Heritage and the work of this man, Eric Deloney, who produced a comparative study. But also, Mark was the primary driver behind this work. We had to look further afield to see whether there was anything comparable. And Quebec keeps coming up. But Quebec is much later and much less interesting in many respects. So this is elements of extracts from the comparative study that Mark did. And there is the Quebec Bridge in the bottom right. And one of the noticeable things is that it must be a buoy because there aren't any curves. It's really very, very unexciting. But actually, no, it is interesting, and I have visited it. And in its own right, it's a truly marvelous structure with its own history. There wasn't much else on the World Heritage List in its own right as a bridge. This is probably the only bridge that really there was, which is the Puente Vizcaya in the Basque Country on the outskirts of Bilbao, up the river. So a very fine transporter bridge. But a lot of that was replaced after the Civil War. So really there was nothing, I think, that came anywhere close in terms of quality compared to the Forth Bridge. So we were pretty confident about that. And we obviously needed to demonstrate the cultural impact of the bridge. So Iron Brew was the first choice in terms of demonstrating the significance of the bridge to a bewildered international audience. So that was a very brief run through super slim nomination document and the management plan. Now this is the bit that's really important. Now obviously these days with Palmyra and all the dreadful things that have happened, both natural and unnatural, to World Heritage Sites, there is a real worry about the condition of many World Heritage Sites. But when World Heritage first kicked off, really nobody submitted a management plan. It wasn't even thought about. And I understand from colleagues in Ironbridge, Barry Trinder, in fact, that when they nominated Ironbridge, it was done in 2 weeks, so almost on the back of an envelope, and that was it. But over the decades, it became clear that if you're going to put something on the World Heritage List, if you're going to put it onto the world stage in the way that people do, then you need to be able to look after it. And you need to be able to convince UNESCO that you can look after it, because the last thing they want is something that comes onto the World Heritage List and then falls down or something dreadful happens to it through neglect. So these days you have to submit a management plan. And that in some ways is one of the biggest challenges, certainly for us. So this is the second volume in the box set, the management plan. And as I hinted early on, the key to this is partnership. So we had, in the core group of that partnership, we had Visit Scotland, Network Rail, the councils, and ourselves, and Transport Scotland in particular, and that proved to be a crucial part of the whole process. So everybody signed up, and I have to tell you, this is not to tell anybody else, but the most difficult part of putting this dossier together was getting the electronic signatures of all of these chief executives. Absolutely unbelievable. And one or two of them came in as sort of 2 kilobyte rough stains on bits of paper, so I had to augment a few of them using software just to make them legible, but you don't know that. So, isn't it funny the way the tiniest of things become massive obstacles in a large job? So the management involves lots of things. It involves monitoring, and just so that we can tell UNESCO that actually it's okay, it's doing fine, and so on. And we were extremely fortunate once again to have owners in Network Rail and what we call a partnership management agreement with the 2 local authorities and then Historic Scotland that provided a management system of consents and monitoring and so on that is done automatically. Because it's an operational structure, this is all done routinely. And extremely fortunate that Network Rail have provided a healthy budget for the ongoing annual maintenance of the bridge. So there is work happening constantly to make sure it's okay. So all of this was tremendously good in terms of convincing UNESCO that this was a worthy candidate. We also had the recent restoration, as I mentioned, which is absolutely compelling. One of the big issues, and those of you that have any involvement in World Heritage Sites will know, is the buffer zone. And we, shortly after submitting the nomination dossier, we had a visitation from some Polish people, including the Polish chair of ICOMOS, the International Council on Monuments and Sites, the UNESCO experts. And before he said anything else, he just said, you've got to have a buffer zone. You have to have a buffer zone. And we said, well, we don't really want a buffer zone because we don't think we need a buffer zone. And we had this slightly difficult argument for a while, and I just said, oh, for goodness sake, it's not as if we're building a new bridge next to it. Fortunately, he hadn't seen the new bridge. And in fact, we subsequently managed to persuade everybody, ICOMOS included, that a buffer zone was not necessary in this instance, because how do you create a meaningful buffer zone with something this size, with this scale of visibility? And what we managed to do was to create what we call a bridgehead zone, and the bridgehead zone actually is an amalgam of existing designations, because there's a whole plethora of natural and unnatural cultural protection regimes that protect the area around the bridge, immediately around the bridge. And we felt that adding something like a buffer zone, which has no statutory status in the planning system anyway, we felt that would just complicate things. So we're relying upon an existing package of designations, and added to which we are also going to define some key viewpoints which need to be protected from further away. So that's the way we're doing it, and as you'll see in a moment, that seemed to work. So the other thing was that Rebanks provided us with what he called a shopping list of potential benefits. I've put this deliberately small so you can't read it. But there were 3 categories of benefits that he felt that in the process of nomination that we should aim for and we should put into the management plan. And these were national benefits where the Scottish government and the UK governments would be really keen for something positive to come from the inscription, regional benefits, and then local benefits. Now, it's not all about benefits, and those of us that work with the local communities know that parking, for example, and traffic is already an issue in both Queensferries. And so issues such as public transport, so sustainable transport, traffic management, car parking, all of that is absolutely crucial in the process of managing. So although we're not talking about managing the World Heritage Site itself, which is only the bridge, we are talking about managing the impact on the areas around the bridge. So maximizing the benefits, trying to minimize any of the negative impacts that might come. And in particular, dealing with potential surges in tourism if they arise. And I was particularly interested visiting the bridge one day to notice this no parking sign on the right-hand side. And so what happens to Queensferry is that when boats come in, these lighters full of tourists come ashore, they declare the pier a custom sort of immigration black spot, so nobody can go anywhere near it. They suspend all the parking, and then these buses come, and they take them to the castle, where we, Historic Environment Scotland, take all their money, and they take them back, and they get back on the boat, and all that's happened for Queensferry is that they've lost all their parking, and their businesses haven't benefited. Now, that's an extreme exaggeration, but that, in essence, is the danger, and it does happen to an extent, and therefore there are issues about how we manage tourism, and if we manage to improve the profile of the bridge and get more visitors, we need to think about how we do that, and we need to coordinate that both locally, regionally, and nationally. So that's my steam train, which is supposed to be sustainable, but sustainable public transport's a big issue. Obviously, with deregulation still being the order of the day, how do you actually manage to manage public transport legally without contravening competition legislation in the UK? So here's the fun bit. How are we doing for time? We're okay for time? Okay, good. So what happened? Well, what happened was that a group of us went to join the UK delegation in Bonn. Now, the first thing you have to recognise about World Heritage nominations in Scotland is that because of the 18th of September last year, we don't put in World Heritage nominations, the UK government does. And therefore, whether we like it or not, whatever your political feelings, you have to work through the Department of Culture, Media and Sport in London. So you have to develop a really positive working relationship, which we have. So this is a UK nomination, and we were part of the UK delegation. And this is the former West German Parliament building in Bonn. So we joined the UK delegation, and we were in what I referred to as the UK bunker on the right-hand side at the back, because we weren't in the World Heritage Committee itself. They were in the middle. And the most important thing about this was that we were in a sort of enclave of English-speaking countries. Being English-speaking countries, they don't really speak other languages. So the reward for that was that the only screen, because there were two screens, the only screen we could see was the French screen, directly opposite. It was a form of punishment. And it was hugely good fun. And this is a sort of close view of the World Heritage Committee in process. And they do scrutinize. For every World Heritage nomination, every one of the 21 members has to have a say. And you sit there cringing, hoping they're not going to ask awkward questions. Because what then happens is the International Council on Monuments and Sites tries to answer the question for you, and then if they don't do it sufficiently, then you have to answer the question. Or at least I was allocated to do that. So a bit terrifying. And guess what? When it came to the moment, they read our nomination out in French. And I thought that was absolutely marvelous. I mean, Old Alliance and all that. But it really did add a certain kudos, a sort of glamour and exoticism to the whole thing. And I at least understood some of it, which wasn't too bad with my schoolboy French. So here's an amalgam of pictures. Now, perhaps the most significant one was Lebanon at the top. Lebanon, for some reason, took against us not having a buffer zone. Maybe there's a really big sort of buffer zone obsession in Lebanon. You can understand why, perhaps. But this kept coming up, and it was unsettling, to say the least. We were conscious that we were been quite friendly with Japan, and there was a big row going on with Korea, so they were a bit worried about the Koreans. And it was pointed out to me, actually a while back, that this is very like Eurovision. And if you aggravate one particular country, then they vote in blocks. So we were quite nervy about South Korea. The lady in pink on the right-hand side was significant because that's Birgitta Ringback, host country. She was the president of ICOMOS, the professional advisors for UNESCO. And she said some really, really positive things. And she said she liked the thinness of it. She liked the super slim mode, and so that made us feel quite good. So ultimately, bottom left, the Indian vice chair said, so the lady on the top left, who had delivered everything in French, then spoke in English and protected us against the ravages of criticism from Lebanon. And absolutely marvelous, because just before then, Mark, who was sat behind me, handed over a full sheet of A4 notes on what I had to say. And I looked at them and just thought, oh my God, what do I do? But very fortunately, ICOMOS did it for us. The work that we'd done with them proved to be absolutely fine. And so the lady on the left, she banged a hammer, and that was wonderful. Now, the man on the right, in the middle there, the microphone sat next to me in my green tie, which the Canadians complained about because it ruined all their photographs. That is a minister in the Scottish Government. So there's a story here which was a little traumatic. Unknown to us, the Minister for Culture in the UK government had written to Nicola Sturgeon saying, in the event of you being successful, we'd like you to send, the Scottish Government, to send a minister to give the 2-minute thank you speech. And of course, we're going, oh no, God, no, that's awful. It means we have to work. We have to, as officials, we have to write the speech. We have to do the briefing. We have to go meet him. And it's a nightmare. It really complicates the whole thing. So initially that was, but then we thought, well, okay, it's good. It's a great honor and everything else. But we didn't know which minister it was going to be. And so only at the last minute did we discover it was going to be Marco Biaggi, who some of you will know as the Minister for Local Government and Community Engagement. And we swiftly looked him up just to check on his pedigree. And the web is, and if you press images on the Google search, an immense number of pictures came up with him with marrows and courgettes. And it turns out that there'd been a mega sort of allotment initiative. And anyway, we didn't really know, did we? Sharon had to go and get him. We didn't really know what to expect, but he turned out to be marvelous. Sat on his right, on the left of the picture, was a sinister-looking person who was our UK government minder, who was a Scotsman called Keith Nichol. And we were very mindful of not repeating a kind of Salmond, Wimbledon, saltire waving, embarrassing episode, just to keep relations nice and smooth. And to our slight concern, for the better part of the session, Mr. Biaggi completely rewrote his speech in fountain pen. So we had sort of tried to sort of share what was going to be said beforehand, but so we didn't really know what he was going to say. Equally, almost all the other victorious countries had about 3 mayors, ministers, and they went on for 10 minutes instead of the 2 minutes. It was all awfully embarrassing. So we were really anxious that we, Scotland, obeyed the rules and did it properly. And he did a grand job. It was spot on 2 minutes. It was said all the right things. It was just a fantastic moment. So that was that. And I wanted to say, oh, it's a giant cantilever crane again. This is Nagasaki. And I wanted to say that this session in the World Heritage Committee was extraordinary because there were 5 other industrial inscriptions. One of the most important was the giant cantilever crane in Nagasaki Harbour, built in 1909, survived the atomic bomb, and is still in use today by Mitsubishi. And so it was really, really nice to see that piece of Scottish engineering also inscribed, as well as a dockyard built by Hull Russell of Aberdeen on the other side of the harbour, which is a national monument built in 1868 as part of the Japanese nomination. So Scottish Industrial Heritage did pretty well. This is a view of the crane which was included within the Scottish 10 project, the data for which was handed over by the Cabinet Secretary to the Japanese on the 1st of July. So, one of the priorities that we have now is not to end up back at the World Heritage Committee in the doghouse. Because what happens is, if you fail to control development, if somebody thinks that you are doing a bad job looking after your World Heritage site, then you get effectively cited and you have to go and defend what's happening. And so next year's World Heritage Committee is in Istanbul. I'm not sure where the one after that is, but a major aim is to actually make sure through the management plan and through the management group we just set up that everything works and that we do not find ourselves in disgrace having to defend ourselves. And often actually you're not in disgrace, it's just very unfortunate the way life is and you have to go and tell them what you're planning to do. But so this isn't the end of the line. We will, on a regular cycle of reporting, have to tell UNESCO what's going on, what we're doing, how we're promoting the site, and we're expected to promote it as well. But there are other things that we want to do with the World Heritage inscription, and one of them is to build on conservation skills. Now, many of you will know that we have a big conservation skills project called the Engine Shed. We have a lot of traditional skills in historic Scotland, but we don't have many practical industrial conservation skills. So we want to use the kudos of the Forth Bridge. We want to bring younger generations of people, or lure them away from the world of smartphones and passive consumption into the world, wonderful world, the riveting world of engineering. And so this was the 125th birthday of the bridge on the 4th of March. A spectacular birthday cake, which was edible, I understand, even the turquoise rocks underneath the bridge. And I don't know whether the school was accidentally there. Whatever it was, they were the focus of the celebrations, which was it's a wonderful day involving a Typhoon jet and a Spitfire, amongst other things. But we already have initiatives involving young scientists and engineers. We've indeed have in the past had events such as this with the Minister for Young People, Aileen Campbell, in her constituency at Biggar Gasworks, one of Historic Environment Scotland's industrial sites. So we want to build on this sort of activity and use the bridge. So there are going to be educational streams running through the management plans, through the proposed actions, to try to make the most of it. And this is the engine shed I mentioned a moment ago, which is the big project which will open in Stirling next year. One of the other things we've been doing is using our the 3D laser scanning expertise that we picked up on the giant cantilever crane in Nagasaki and applying it on a massive scale to the Forth Bridge. Now, this is an immense job. We started several months ago, and we're still going. Ian, we've still got a wee bit of Ian said 97% done. It involves night shifts because you have to take possession of the line at times when there's no trains. And I'm very fortunate to have some hot off the press images from my colleague Chris McGregor over there. Chris has been joining the night shifts, and this has involved, amongst other things, putting together a bespoke bogie carrying a laser scanner and a GPS system and running it backwards and forwards at, I think, 25-meter intervals, possibly a bit more, just scanning everything from every possible angle to minimize the blind spots. There were 200 different scans on the crane in Nagasaki. There will be thousands, all of which have to be sewn together. And then with our partners in the Glasgow School of Art, we will, in the Digital Design Studio, we will then be adding the visualization to create models and education resources, interpretation resources, management tools for induction, health and safety, that virtual tours, games, all sorts of things, much as we did in Nagasaki. So this is the rig that was pushed up and down, these are Chrissy's photographs. You can see the rig in the foreground on the left there, and the fantastic illuminations that Network Rail have installed, which on the deck itself, Chris described one of his photographs as a cathedral because it just truly extraordinary, a real sense of drama and scale. And so we have some initial results, but this is going to take a very, very long time to sew everything together and remove all the blind spots and impurities in the scanning to produce the perfect model. But we're well on our way now. I suspect that we'll have something meaningful by the middle of next year. In the meantime, we'll be moving on to do the road bridge and then the third Forth bridge as well. So the last thing that happened was, after being inscribed, we were sent by UNESCO our own logo. So this is our brand. We're not allowed to use it to sell things, but we do need to put it onto all of our interpretation or our free stuff, or the signage that helps people understand the importance of the bridge. So this in itself is a great asset and something we will be looking forward to using to a great extent in the future. And that really leaves the celebration. And we tried to persuade Fife Council to shell out £300,000 for fireworks, but they didn't really see it. Douglas Spears offered us a Catherine wheel, which was kind of him. But there are issues of burning resources in such a way, and so we've adopted very much a slow burn in terms of a sustainable slow burn in terms of celebrating the inscription. So we will be marking the inscription and building on what's happened incrementally over the next few years in a way that doesn't cause massive, unsustainable, intrusive surges of tourism in the communities, in a way that actually tries to extract the maximum benefits we can for everybody from the inscription of the Forth Bridge. That's me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Miles. So we've got time for questions and comments. Before we have any though, could I just say, could you wait for a microphone to be given to you so we can hear what your question or comment is, please?
I should say only easy questions, if you don't mind. That's a breeze.
Thank you very much. That was absolutely delightful lecture. And if I may say to you and to Mark, welcome to that very exclusive club. But my question is really about the definition of the monument itself. How did you decide where to end it, north and south of the Forth? And did you also consider including any of the ancillary structures, including, for example, the military installations which were built to protect the bridge?
That's a very, very good question, David. And the answer is yes, we did consider a variety of structures to include. And in the end, whenever you put together a World Heritage Site, remembering the nomination document, you have to demonstrate the outstanding universal value of every bit of it. And we felt that the best and most manageable way of doing that was only to nominate the bridge itself, because even the railway stations, which was the obvious thing on either end, they're lovely. I mean, they're already protected. They have high levels of statutory protection, but they don't necessarily have the outstanding universal value that the bridge has. So we used the structure of the bridge itself as defined physically and by the contracts that were put out to build it as the means of defining the bridge. So if you look at the maps associated with the nominated property, it's just the bridge, nothing else.
You may want to edit out this question and answer from the proceedings. Taking you back to earlier industrial history, in the early 1960s, I worked for the National Coal Board, and we were competing against oil for the next major power station after Cockenzie. And the new power station coming on stream would push Cockenzie down the load factor and would have released large quantities of coal from the major new collieries such as Bilson Glen and the existing very productive ones like Lady Victoria. So the obvious thing was and we had to bid for a 20-year contract on a delivered price basis. Normally, coal was sold at a pithead basis. So that meant that the coal board had to absorb the transport cost. So the big thing was to minimize that as well as the production cost of the coal. And so we started off drawing large quantities from Lothians, but were then told by British Rail, no, you cannot take continuous coal trains over the Forth Bridge because it is not strong enough on an engineering basis. And so you will find that we didn't draw on the Lothians collieries, and we had to have other supplies, including new developments. What changed?
Okay, first off, it's very interesting to hear about the coal industry. It's one of my specialisms, and that whole story is really fascinating. But I'm going to cheat here because I have somebody in the audience that can answer that question directly. So Ian's looking slightly concerned, but coal on the bridge.
Coal on the bridge. Good evening, my name is Ian Heath of Network Rail. And I will start off by saying I know a lot about the bridge. I know a lot about painting the bridge. The structural capacity of the bridge I'm not quite so sure on, but however, I will try and answer. In terms of the loading arrangements back in the day, I would need to know about things like axle arrangements and so on to see what was actually making the bridge fail effectively by design checking and so on and so forth. What did come in and what has been in over certainly the last 20 years or so is a limited allowance for freight transportation across the bridge. It's basically only one train at any one time. But even then, we need to be very careful of that very axle arrangement going across the bridge. So I can only kind of guess that back in the day, when the time you're thinking of, we had a heavier axle load, which in fact, when you analyse through the bridge, there are elements of the bridge would theoretically fail. But I've got to say that's a little bit of a guess on my part.
Thank you.
What I do know today is certainly we can take very substantial loading by way of train loading. We had almost 4,000 tonnes of scaffold temporarily on the bridge. So the bridge is in a very, very good state of repair and structurally sound. But without knowing the actual arrangement of the train layout back in your time, I can't really comment further. Apologies.
I notice sat next to you is a former colleague of mine who used to share who is a ferroequinologist. He used to share his railway knowledge with us regularly at the Royal Commission. He had his arm raised. He may have something to add on axles, perhaps. No.
As a long-term, semi-permanent resident of that institution known as the Dunfermline Flyer, has anybody mentioned the words Forth Bridge and electrification in the same sentence?
No. I can probably, you will correct me, yes? Yeah, yes, but the answer is yes, obviously. And that was one of the issues that perhaps arrested the progress of the earlier nomination and was a major factor behind the Great Western Railway not going forward, which was also in the 1999 tentative list. But I think since then there has been a view that electrification wouldn't necessarily be a problem on the bridge, and so it's not feared in the way that it was in the past.
Again, just adding a little bit of what I know. I'm not directly involved in it, but it's certainly being considered. We would have to have a very close look at particular arrangements above the train level, because what you have in the bridge is a very, very confined triangle of space to actually get trains through. And then to introduce overhead wires, pantographs, and so on and so forth has always been a challenge. But with the movement of particularly the ingenuity and the use of battery power and so on and so forth, there may be scope in the middle future to possibly do that and open that up. But there are other challenges throughout the Fife Circle and structures beyond the bridge. Tunnels and the likes are a fair old challenge too.
I was intrigued by the discussion about the problems with the concept of the buffer zones. To me, there is already a splendid buffer zone, the river itself. And was that put forward at any stage as being the solution? Because 90% of the major views of the bridge are, of course, the ones which feature the river in foreground and background.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very good point. In fact, one of the criticisms that Professor Scot, the evaluator, had for us was that we hadn't actually considered the water sufficiently carefully. And the fact that the water is regulated, there is a very seriously potent regulatory regime that protects the water is important. And I think we just have to remember that in UNESCO and ICOMOS world, there are certain things that they fear greatly, and one of them is wind farms, and with the advent of floating wind farms and all sorts of things, there are potential things that could happen on water. So they were a little, whilst it's a great form of protection in its own right, even water can be corrupted if we're ingenious.
Right. Thanks, Simon.
You mentioned the visitor centre just briefly.
Yes.
I understand that there is quite a developed plan, including options for people walking over the bridge at some point. How is that factored into the management plan?
Well, when the management plan was first drafted, there were no solid proposals, but we knew that they might potentially come. Equally, in the management plan's actions and intentions, there was an intention to investigate how the bridge could be accessed, because it is a requirement of any World Heritage Site of UNESCO, stated in the guidelines, to open up if you can and to present in the best possible way your World Heritage Site. So that was the intention. It's only since then that the proposals for like the Sydney Harbour type experience on the south side and a visitor experience on the north side, converting the existing lift into 2 lifts that take people up to the top safely, are being proposed potentially. But that's still in the making, and no formal proposals have been put yet. But Network Rail have been very transparent in putting proposals out, and there's a website devoted to providing as much information as possible. So you can find out about it if you wish to.
Yeah.
I just wondered why, for your nomination document, you chose Turner's depiction of Brunel's brick sounding arches in Maidenhead.
Oh, sorry, yes, that was the UK tentative list. Thank you, Mark. It wasn't in our nomination document. No, no, it wasn't in the nomination document.
Oh, right.
Yeah,
Okay.
so you had me worried there for a moment. We had an incident this morning in our management group where somebody said, "You put this in your management plan." I'm thinking, I don't remember writing that. Oh my God! And it turned out to be a comment from somebody in the consultation rather than actually what we wrote. So, yeah, sorry, that wasn't clear from my slide.
Right, Bob.
One of the, I think, major deficiencies in the sort of heritage of Scotland, or the record of the heritage of Scotland, is any photograph of those two great heavyweight iron steel symbols of British power together. In other words, BT's battle cruisers passing under the Forth Bridge. I've never seen one. Have your trails through the archives produced anything pointing in that direction?
No, they haven't, but we haven't really looked yet. And again, one of the functions of a management plan is as Leslie McInnes, who's here, will confirm, who's our head of World Heritage Coordination in Historic Environment Scotland, is to develop lots of streams of activity. And different streams of research are done in all World Heritage sites, and we hope to be able to carry out research of that sort in order to... and we also want, one of the ideas we've had is a much more sort of publicly engaging thing, which is to try to get people to send in photographs taken from their smartphones possibly of instances where the Forth Bridge has been used. Like, there's a company called Forth Bridge Demolition, for example. There's some really weird uses out there of the Forth Bridge on trucks, on cars, on stationery. So there's lots of research projects from the very cerebral to the really quite wacky that we'd like to use to learn more about the bridge and to publicly engage more effectively.
Well, thank you very much, everybody, for your comments and your interest this evening. We've heard two fascinating presentations tonight, and please don't forget Martin's request for more information or support on the project he's doing on cranes. But the main talk tonight by Miles, absolutely fascinating. I've spent the last 35 years of my life crossing the bridge several times a day, hardly giving it a thought. It's difficult to see it from sitting inside a train, actually, is one of the problems when you're on it. But it is such a fascinating, wonderful structure. And a talk about administration, about bureaucracy, about people getting round the table. You made it sound so incredibly interesting. And let the bridge itself and its iconic status shine through. So we're very grateful to you for that. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
It just remains for me to remind you that our anniversary meeting, the AGM, is here at 4:30 on the 30th of November with a drinks reception, and it will be followed by a short address by Jane Ryder, the first chair of Historic Environment Scotland. So thank you very much.